welcome to my channel. Sit back and listen to the best true crime stories. Let's go. November 9th, 1971 was a very special day for John Emil List. On that day, he realized that it was time to do something special, something that could completely erase his past life and rewrite it from scratch. In this life, which Leaf is impossibly bored, 46-year-old man headed one of the branches of the Bank of Westfield. In a luxurious two-story Victorian-style mansion for 19 rooms, he waited for his unloved 46-year-old wife Helen, 3 children, and elderly mother Alma. And on Sundays, List had to struggle to play the role of Sunday school teacher. Outwardly, the List family seemed prim and proper. Helen fulfilled the role of mistress of a large house and mother of 3 children. John was considered a serious man with conservative views, a good family man and a successful leader. Always well-mannered and not verbose, dressed smartly and attentive, the epithet good suited him best. No one would have imagined that in reality, the fires of fierce hatred raged in the soul of this unassuming man towards literally every member of his family. John especially hated Helen, who he considered to be a mean, bilious, slovenly woman who was also seriously addicted to the bottle. Helen had always been a drinker, but in recent years it had become her constant companion. She woke up with a bottle and stayed up all night with it. And when she was drunk, she became irritable and prickly, snidely mocking all the actions and habits of her husband. Because of her, in the house was always a mess, so annoying John, since childhood suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder. But most of all, Lista insulted her words that her husband is talentless, not able to earn a decent income and fulfill marital duty. Sarcastic words Helen every time, as if sharp needles pierced into the soul and so restless List. But instead of confronting, he sighed submissively, lowered his head, and tried to pacify the raging wife. And then he would go away and think of ways to get new money that would at least temporarily shut his wife's mouth. Sometimes, the flames of the all-consuming flame would burst out, as if breaking through Leaf's artificial defenses. And then no one could understand what happened to the suave John. That's how, 3 weeks ago, before he could douse the sparks of anger that had leaked out, he'd sassed the owner of the bank where he worked right to his face. How dare he question my integrity? Leaf justified himself, adding that a few stolen thousands of dollars the bank did not even notice, and he urgently needed the money to pay off the mortgage. List to hell tired of the mask of integrity and patience. All 3 weeks after the defeated dismissal, he pretended to go to work at the bank. Without admitting to anyone that he had lost his job, he put on an ironed suit, read the newspaper with a cup of coffee, took sandwiches for lunch, kissed his wife, and hurriedly went to the train station. But when he got there, he slowed down immediately. He bought newspapers and read on the benches, drinking several cups of coffee and eating them with homemade sandwiches. I watched people, always in a hurry, fidgeting, and not much like happy people. And thinking. He dreamed of erasing his identity, and with it the life he had lived. Something different than he had dreamed of in his youth. His thoughts went back in time and tried to find the moment when everything went wrong. And, realizing that there was nothing more to be done with this life, Leaf tried to find a way to erase his failures. No, it's not my fault. I'm just unlucky, he told himself, mentally choking on his anger. It started with me being born into the wrong family, and then that unfortunate arranged marriage. Screaming kids with their whims. Unattractive and sickly Helen, a grouchy mother. Nobody ever understood me. They all want something from me all the time. Usually money, those constant sock suits, the big house and luxury. I've given them everything, but nobody hears me. Where am I supposed to get the money to pay off the loan? Should I admit I'm a loser? So, sitting on a bench at the train station, one day a plan matured in John List's head. Ingenious, he thought, and very simple. You can erase your life, and with it, all those who are the source of his suffering. All he had to do was kill them and leave. Go far away from here, and build his personality anew, without all these demands on the mortgage, without a drunken screaming wife and cranky children, without losing his home and the respect of others. After all, it's not hard at all to implement his plan. List and intended to November 9, 1971. After waiting for his sons and daughter to leave for school, he approached his wife sitting at the table from behind and shot her in the back of the head. Her head jerked violently and then fell to the dining table, staining the snow-white tablecloth with scarlet splatters and streaks of black coffee. This picture of dirt and disorder further infuriated Leaf, who couldn't stand chaos. But he looked away from the sprawling brown mess, mentally promising himself that he would clean it up afterward. List then went up to the bedroom and shot his 84-year-old mother, who was lying in bed. These actions made him somewhat agitated and tired, and so a hungry List decided to have lunch. Having made himself comfortable with a piece of dried ham in his hand, sitting on a chair and staining his shirt with meat sauce, the former bank clerk tried to get used to the feeling of freedom. Turning to his now forever silenced wife, he monotonously reprimanded her for all her offenses. He remembered the barbs in his address, bad sex, and obsessive female demand for more and more portions of money and husband's success. Then, embodying an elaborate list of actions, he went to the bank to close his accounts, emptying them and cashing in his mother's bonds. After going back into the house again, he quietly waited for the children to come home from school. When 16-year-old daughter Patricia and 13-year-old son Frederick showed up at home, John List shot them in the back of the head from behind, too. But with 15-year-old John, there was a hiccup that day. It just so happened that his son had a game at school. The boy played forward on the school's soccer team. After cheering for him in the stands for a while, List brought John Jr. home and silently, without explaining anything, shot him in the heart and face. He was beginning to feel at peace, but it was too early to rest, for the erasure of his unfortunate identity was not yet complete. At first, he informed the milkman and the letter carrier of the temporary withdrawal of their services. Then he telephoned some acquaintances and the school of the murdered children, and in a confident and calm voice told of the family's departure for a vacation with Helen, his mother. Those calls made by Leaf will be remembered by many for a long time to come, going over the words spoken by this mass murderer. With disgust and physical squeamishness, will recount to the police jokes inserted by Leaf in the explanation. After all, at the time, no one could have imagined that they were talking to a man calling from a house literally full of corpses. After completing the routine, but required, calls, in the killer's opinion, he wrapped the bodies of his wife and children in blankets, dragging them all into the mansion's ballroom. He decided not to bother with dragging the body of his heavy mother from the second floor, leaving her where he had killed her, in bed. Afterward, he went about the important business of cleaning the house and carefully cutting out his own image from the family portraits. Apparently, List wanted to make it harder for the police to find him, and he eventually succeeded. The next day, John turned down the thermostat and tuned the radio to a religious tune after looking around his never-loved and now blood-stained home. Then he left the house he hated so much. After driving to JFK Airport in New York, he abandoned the car and disappeared for years, going to mold a new identity. The List family was missed only a month later, in December 1971. All this time in many rooms of the mansion around the clock lights were on, until all the bulbs one by one did not burn out. But neighbors, acquaintances, and teachers from the school didn't see any of the sheets and began to worry about their prolonged absence. Eventually, one of 16-year-old Patricia's teachers contacted the police, who decided to search the house. Investigators were horrified to find 5 dead bodies and 2 murder weapons in the List lavish mansion on December 7, 1971. A Steyr 1912 9mm semi-automatic pistol that List owned, and a Colt .22 caliber pistol that once belonged to his father, and then received some clarification of the circumstances of this gruesome case. Before leaving, John List left a message on his office desk to a local pastor. The 5-page letter was florid, rambling and lengthy in describing why List had decided to kill his family. The main thrust of this narrative was the phrases, "My family has drifted away from God," and "I have seen too much evil and have killed them all to save their souls." An investigation into the life of John List revealed quite quickly that behind the outwardly respectable facade lurked a very weak and deceitful nature. John List was born in the small town of Bay City, Michigan, and was the only child of very strict conservative parents John Frederick List and German-born Alma Maria Barbara Florence Havinger. The List family was very devout, and it was by repeating his father's experience that John List, Jr. later became a Sunday school teacher. In 1943, he briefly fell into the crucible of World War II, and at the end of the war he enrolled at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where he earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in accounting. In November 1950, he was again drafted into the war, now the Korean War. While in the U.S. Army, at Fort Eustis, Virginia, he met his future wife, Helen Morris Taylor, the widow of an infantry officer killed in Korea. John and Helen were married on December 1, 1951, in Baltimore, and the family soon moved to Northern California, where List worked in the Army Staff Accounting Office. After leaving the service, he took jobs in fairly reputable accounting offices where he managed to establish himself as a very meticulous employee. Gradually, the List family had 3 children, but the older Helen got, the more she drank, and her mental instability extended over longer periods. In 1960, the Sheets move again, this time to Rochester, where John manages to get a job at Xerox. A year later, he already heads the entire accounting division of the company. And in 1965, he was invited to the post of vice president of the Bank of Westfield, and the List family settled in the ill-fated Victorian mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue. It is here, 6 years later, that the entire family is killed by John List. At first, the police, finding out the details of the escaped killer's biography, will be perplexed as to what caused his breakdown. However, just a little digging deeper, it turns out that law-abiding, and on the look of the good American, for many years, day in and day out violated a lot of both legal and ethical laws. He cheated people and manipulated employees, spent wildly, cleaned out the account of his mother and wife, stole tens of thousands of dollars from the bank, and accumulated a lot of loans. At the same time, he probably always forgave himself for transgressions, but others had no right to weaknesses. Neighbors recalled that John always annoyingly controlled his wife and children, not allowing any of them to linger anywhere. He limited contact with friends and family, effectively forcing them to stay home all the time and lead a hermit's life. And occasionally, when the Sheets were invited to some festivities, always dressed in a strict suit, stood somewhere in the corner and looked at the merrymaking people with condemnation. All this characterized John List in a very significant way. But in spite of a national search for him, he seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The car he abandoned at the airport turned out to be a ruse designed to confuse the investigation. Checked flights did not show that the killer did not get on the plane. Only 18 years later it became known that, leaving the car at the airport terminal, the killer took first a train to Michigan and then a bus, and 2,500 kilometers to Denver, where he did not grieve and did not think long, and got a job. A cook in a hotel, calling himself Robert Peter Bob Clark. A year later, List, overnight became Clark, changed jobs, getting a job as an accountant in a large office H&R Block. He began attending the local Lutheran church, where he soon met a pretty 48-year-old widow named Dolores Miller. Not 6 months later, they were married, moving to Richmond, Virginia. God knows what it was about this new personality and lifestyle that pleased List more than his former one. He lived very poorly, in a tiny 2-room house, had no children and the respect of society. However, faithfully loved his wife Dolores, felt happy, arranged parties, was a nice guy for neighbors, no longer chasing luxury, did not generate loans, and fraud was not seen. Everyone loved him, considered him a pleasant and companionable man, ready to help anyone. People came to him for advice, and in fact, the house of the new John List became a place where people always gathered. It seemed that this strange man, erasing, as if eraser, his previous record of life, became quite different. He simply began anew. A new character, a new town and work, a new wife and habits. He probably would have grown old in peace had it not been for the American television show America's Most Wanted. On May 21, 1989, in one of the broadcasts, host John Walsh told the story of the tattered List family and then showed the successfully executed clay bust of the missing John List to the whole of America. Forensic artist and anthropologist Frank Bender, after imagining how the killer might have aged in 18 years, created an excellent reproduction of the 64-year-old criminal's appearance. As it turned out later, this sculptural representation was incredibly close to the original. Afterward, there was a plea for the audience to look around and see if there was anyone like him nearby. Not 5 minutes later, the broadcast studio was flooded with hundreds of phone calls. Almost all of the callers were from Richmond and pointed to Robert Clark, who looked remarkably like a John List sculpture. 11 days later, FBI agents arrived at the accounting firm where Clark worked and picked him up for questioning, during which he vehemently denied being a mass murderer. However, fingerprints don't lie, and they unequivocally indicated that the peaceful and quiet-looking accountant, who had been living under the name Robert Clark for 18 years, was in fact a rabid beast, a Westfield monster named John List. For another 8 months, he refused to admit to being a mass murderer, sitting in front of investigators, looking them straight in the eye, expressing no emotion, fear, or regret. And only in February 1990, as if again tired of being responsible for a new identity, he confessed to the murder of 5 people. He explained that he had killed his family to spare them from humiliation. The accusations of bank theft, the embezzlement of his mother and wife's money, the loss of his job, and the expected loss of his home could have driven his family to despair. Only death could spare them the shame, and List simply became the instrument that sent his loved ones to heaven. Numerous evaluations have confirmed that John List is mentally perfectly healthy, except for his obsessive-compulsive disorder and lack of emotion. He was always aware that he was doing wrongful and illegal things, but he felt no remorse, or at least no regret, describing the story of his murders in a chillingly calm manner, as if he were retelling a mediocre movie he watched yesterday. In 1990, John List, the classic family annihilator, was brought to trial, where he told his version of events. According to List, the main problem in his life was probably his marriage to Helena. Initially, when they first started dating, he had no feelings of love for her, but only nurtured a fleeting attraction. But one day Helen announced that she was pregnant, and pious John had no choice but to marry her. However, it soon turned out that the pregnancy was a made-up reason, designed only to force Leaf to officially take Helen in marriage. So this marriage from the first minutes began to be mixed with lies and humiliation. Later, with each passing day, John came to a growing realization that he and Helen, people from a completely different test. The woman had a weakness for alcohol, was a bad housewife, and an equally bad mother. Her habit of throwing things and empty bottles around the house, inability to manage the budget, and excessive demands for comfort led to paranoid John prone to cleanliness and order in a frenzy. In the end, it turned out that the spouses have literally nothing in common. Helen became increasingly attached to the bottle and degraded as a person. But worst of all, she had power over her husband, suppressing and humiliating him in every possible way. After a few years, List began to notice physical abnormalities in his wife, and although with difficulty, but forced her to confess that it turns out that for many years she has been suffering from tertiary syphilis. For reference, tertiary syphilis is the third period of syphilis that develops in inadequately treated patients or patients who have not been treated at all. It manifests as the formation of so-called syphilitic granulomas in the skin, mucous membranes, bones, and internal organs. Granulomas in tertiary syphilis compress and destroy the tissues in which they are located. In the tertiary stage, syphilis is virtually non-infectious. According to Helen, she was once infected by her first husband, but she was ashamed of the disease and never sought medical attention. Over the years, her condition progressed, her nose and cheekbones began to droop, her back and arms were gaping with non-healing wounds. Most importantly, there was mental deterioration. Syphilis, aggravated by alcoholism, was destroying Helen inside and out, and List and the children had to deal with it every day. Pretty soon, a persistent thought developed in John's soul that his wife was an incredible sinner who had forgotten decency and God. By 1971, illness and alcohol abuse, according to John List's testimony, had turned a pretty woman into an unkempt and paranoid recluse, perpetually grouchy and swearing like a cobbler. At times Helen could no longer control herself and insulted List even in public, calling impotent. This marriage became a real torture for John, which he was no longer able to tolerate. having lost his job and foreseeing that he would be left with an alcoholic wife and 3 children on the street. Besides, with tens of thousands of dollars of debt behind him, List saw only 2 ways out of the situation. The first was suicide, which was completely unacceptable to the religious List. The second was to kill the whole family. That's what John chose. After hearing the defendant's speech, the jury eventually found him guilty of 5 murders. The judge sentenced List to 5 life terms behind bars. The killer first agreed to be interviewed on camera in 2002, where he described in unimaginable detail how he killed each member of his family. "I would walk right up to them and shoot them. I mean, they didn't realize until the last minute what I had decided to do. I knew it was wrong, but I felt that when they got to heaven, they wouldn't worry about earthly problems, and they would easily forgive me, realizing that it was the best thing to do." In 2008, at the age of 82, John List died of pneumonia while in custody at a hospital in Trenton, New Jersey. Heaven only knows if he realized what he had done. But reading the story of his crimes, one can't help but wonder how the same man could have lived 2 lives so different from each other. And it's also hard to get away from the idea that to some extent he was held hostage by life's circumstances. Simply, being a weak and unhealthy personality, he eliminated these circumstances in the most horrifying way that a human being is capable of. P.S. On August 20th, 1972, that is, 10 months after the murder of the List family, their 19-room mansion strangely burned down. The cause of the fire, according to the police, was deliberate arson, but the arsonist was never found. And although the walls of this ill-fated house were stained with the blood of 5 people, in reality, it was a real work of art. Only one of the stained glass windows in it, made to order in Tiffany & Co., in those years cost at least $100,000. And another curious fact, to this day, there are theories on the web that John List is incredibly similar to Dan Cooper, the mysteriously disappeared criminal who hijacked a Northwest Airlines Boeing 727-51 on November 24, 1971, and received a ransom of $200,000. But, in my opinion, this similarity is very conditional.